Dr. Emmett Caldwell's horse refused to pass through the gates of Rowan Plantation that September morning in 1853. The animal stamped and wheeled, nostrils flaring at something the physician could not yet smell, something wrong carried on the Kentucky dawn. Caldwell dismounted, his medical bag heavy in his grip, and approached on foot. The iron gates stood open, swaying slightly in wind that shouldn't exist on such a still morning. No one came to meet him, though the urgent summons had arrived at his Lexington office before midnight. Come at once. Emergency at Rowan Plantation. Bring instruments. The note bore Thaddeus Rowan's seal but not his handwriting. The circular drive curved through neglected boxwoods toward the great house, its white columns visible through morning mist rising from the Kentucky River valley. Caldwell's boots crunched on gravel that seemed too loud in the absolute silence. No birdsong. No slave bells marking the dawn work call. No smoke from the kitchen house chimneys. Then he saw the first signs of wrongness. A silver candlestick lay in the grass, tarnished by dew. Further on, a lady's satin slipper, its heel snapped. Shattered window glass glittered like frost across the veranda steps. The front door stood ajar, darkness breathing from within. Caldwell's hand trembled as he pushed the door wider. The hinges screamed. The entry hall stretched before him in gray dawn light filtering through broken windows. A grandfather clock lay face down, its mechanism still ticking uselessly against marble floor. Portrait frames hung askew on the walls. Thaddeus Rowan's stern face now watched the floor rather than intimidating visitors. The smell hit him then, copper and void, the scent of opened bodies and released bowels that no physician ever grows accustomed to, no matter how many deathbeds they attend. Caldwell forced himself forward, past the overturned hall table, past the smear of something dark on the wallpaper. The grand staircase rose before him, and at its top, something swayed. He climbed, each step an eternity, his medical training warring with the primal human urge to flee. At the landing, he stopped. The nursery door stood open. Inside, 3 cradles formed a triangle in the center of the room. Each cradle was occupied, but not by infants. The bodies hung from ropes tied to the cradle's canopy frames, suspended in grotesque parody of swaddled babies, their faces purple and swollen, tongues protruding from mouths frozen in final screams. Thaddeus Rowan hung from an oak cradle carved with cherubs. His wife Constance from white lacquered wood painted with roses. Their eldest son Magnus from an antique cradle that must have rocked Rowan generations. Someone had positioned them carefully, almost tenderly, arranging their limbs as though they were merely sleeping. Someone had taken time with this. Someone had meant this to be seen, to be understood, to be remembered. Caldwell's medical bag fell from nerveless fingers. He stood in that nursery for 5 full minutes before his legs would carry him back down the stairs, back through the violated house, back into Kentucky daylight that seemed obscene in its normalcy. The horse had finally stopped fighting when he reached the gates. It stood quiet now, as though whatever evil had resided here had departed with the night. Caldwell rode for the militia in Paris, Kentucky, his mind already trying and failing to construct an explanation that would make sense of what he'd witnessed. But some sights carve themselves too deeply into memory to ever be explained away. Some horror demands to be understood not as senseless violence, but as message, as monument, as justice of a terrible and irrevocable kind. The Cradles. Dear God, the Cradles. If you're still listening, this story is just beginning. The truth of what happened at Rowan Plantation has been buried for over a century and a half. Subscribe to this channel to hear the rest, and leave a comment telling me what you think about these suppressed historical narratives of resistance that mainstream history refuses to acknowledge. To understand what happened at Rowan Plantation on that September night in 1853, one must first understand what manner of hell it had been for the 200 souls who labored there, and what manner of demons ruled over them. The Rowan family had owned land in Bourbon County, Kentucky since 1791, when Thaddeus Rowan's grandfather claimed 200 acres along a bend in the Kentucky River where the soil ran black and rich, perfect for the tobacco that would build the family fortune. By 1853, the plantation had become one of the most profitable in the county, its bright leaf tobacco commanding premium prices at the Lexington markets. But it had also earned another reputation, whispered about in parlors and slave quarters alike, a reputation for cruelty that shocked even in an age when human bondage was sanctioned by law and church. Thaddeus Rowan was 47 years old that fateful summer, a man of imposing height and cold gray eyes that assessed everything in terms of dollars and cents. He kept meticulous ledgers in his study, recording every bushel of tobacco, every tool purchased, every slave born or acquired or sold. These ledgers were his pride, evidence of his business acumen, proof that he had multiplied his inheritance tenfold through careful management and ruthless efficiency. But Thaddeus's ledgers contained entries that other plantation owners, cruel as they might be, found distasteful to record so explicitly. Thaddeus Rowan had discovered a particular profit center that he exploited with the dedication of a man who had found his true calling: he sold children. Not randomly, not occasionally, but systematically and deliberately. Thaddeus had calculated that enslaved children between the ages of 5 and 12 commanded excellent prices in the deeper South, where cotton plantations in Mississippi and Louisiana paid premium rates for young slaves who could be trained to the work and would provide decades of labor. He had further calculated that separating these children from their parents on his own plantation created no reduction in adult productivity. Grief, he noted in his journals, did not measurably impact tobacco harvesting efficiency. And so Thaddeus Rowan had built a business within his business. Every 2 years, he would conduct an audit of the slave quarters, identifying families with children of prime selling age. He would then negotiate sales with brokers who traveled the cotton south, arranging bulk purchases that maximized his profit. The children would be gathered in the separation shed, a small building behind the tobacco barns where slaves awaiting sale were kept, and from there loaded onto wagons for the journey south. The parents would learn of these sales when they returned from the fields to find their children gone. Thaddeus found this method most efficient, avoiding scenes and disruptions to the work schedule. The children were already 20 miles away before mothers and fathers discovered empty cabins and missing belongings. In 15 years of this practice, Thaddeus Rowan had sold 43 children to destinations across the deep South. He recorded each transaction in his ledgers with the same neat penmanship he used to record tobacco yields: female child, age 7, $450. Male child, age 6, $400. Twin females, age 9, $900 for the pair. His wife Constance was not merely complicit in this horror, she was its enthusiastic architect in the domestic sphere. A woman of refined Charleston breeding, Constance had brought to her marriage a philosophy that slaves required constant vigilance and harsh discipline to prevent them from becoming uppity or melancholy. She took particular offense at enslaved mothers who displayed grief over their sold children, viewing such emotions as evidence of dangerous sentiment that needed to be beaten out. Constance kept her own journal, less meticulous than her husband's ledgers but equally chilling in its cold assessment of human suffering. She wrote of necessary corrections administered to women who wept too long, of food rations reduced for those who showed sullen dispositions, of children who needed to be sold younger to prevent unhealthy attachments from forming. She believed she was performing a service, maintaining proper order in a household that might otherwise descend into chaos. The Rowan children, Magnus, 18, Delphine, 14, and infant Cornelius, not yet 2, were raised in this atmosphere like plants grown in poisoned soil. Magnus had been taken to his first slave auction at age 10, taught to assess human beings the way other boys learned to judge livestock. He had inherited his father's aptitude for numbers and his mother's taste for casual cruelty. By 18, Magnus managed the field workers personally, carrying a hickory cane that he used liberally for infractions real and imagined. Delphine was being groomed for Kentucky society, learning to play piano in a parlor overlooking the quarters where enslaved people lived in windowless log cabins. She practiced her French conjugations while below her window, women who would never learn to read their own names prepared her meals and washed her linens. She had learned from her mother that enslaved people were fundamentally different creatures, incapable of the finer feelings that white families possessed, and therefore not truly suffering when their families were torn apart. Baby Cornelius was too young to have absorbed these lessons yet, but his cradle, hand-carved oak with cherubs and roses, sat in a nursery attended by enslaved women who had lost their own children to her parents' profitable enterprise. These women rocked the Rowan baby to sleep with songs they had once sung to infants now laboring under Mississippi sun, their arms empty, their breasts aching with milk that had nowhere to go. The plantation itself sprawled across prime bottomland along the Kentucky River, its fields stretching in neat rows of tobacco plants that reached toward the sky like praying hands. The great house stood on a slight rise, its white columns visible for miles, a monument to prosperity built on systematized suffering. Behind it, the kitchen house, the smokehouse, the dairy, the laundry, all staffed by enslaved workers who moved through their days under constant surveillance. Further back stood the quarters, 2 rows of log cabins with dirt floors and clay chimneys that barely kept out the Kentucky cold in winter. 87 people lived in these cabins in the summer of 1853, down from 112 5 years earlier. Some had died of disease or injury. Some had run for freedom and succeeded or been caught and sold away as punishment. But most of the missing had been children, sold south, their names recorded in Thaddeus Rowan's ledgers with the same care he recorded his tobacco profits. The separation shed stood at the edge of the tobacco barns, a small building of whitewashed wood that looked innocent enough from outside. But inside, the walls bore scratches where desperate fingers had clawed at boards, and the floor showed dark stains that no amount of lye soap could fully remove. This was where children spent their last night on the only land they'd ever known, listening to their mothers wailing from the quarters, before wagons came to carry them to places whose names they couldn't pronounce. In the great house, Thaddeus kept his study locked, but the enslaved house servants knew what it contained. The ledgers, yes, but also correspondence with slave brokers across the South, negotiating prices and terms. Letters from cotton plantations acknowledging receipt of merchandise. Bank drafts representing the converted value of childhood, of mother love, of family bonds that slaveholders claimed didn't really exist in the Black Heart. This was the kingdom of cruelty that Rowan Plantation had become by the summer of 1853. A place where profit had been refined to its purest form, stripped of any vestige of paternalistic pretense. Thaddeus Rowan didn't claim to be a kind master. He claimed to be an efficient one, and his bank accounts proved his success. But efficiency can be a double-edged blade. The same meticulous record-keeping that Thaddeus prided himself on would become evidence of his crimes. The same systematic approach to maximizing profit had created a community of the bereaved, bound together by shared loss, who remembered every child taken, every family destroyed, every transaction recorded in neat columns of heartbreak. The enslaved community at Rowan Plantation was not broken, despite Thaddeus's confidence that grief made no difference to productivity. They were storing their rage like coals banked for morning, keeping it alive through long nights, feeding it with memory and whispered stories of children who would never come home. And in the summer of 1853, those coals would finally kindle into an inferno that would consume the kingdom of cruelty and leave nothing but ash and horror in its wake. 3 people would become the architects of what happened at Rowan Plantation, though dozens more would play their parts in the night of reckoning. Their names deserve to be remembered, even though history tried its best to erase them: Hestia Blackwood, Monroe Ashford, and Temperance Vale. Hestia Blackwood was 43 years old in the summer of 1853, her hair already streaked with gray despite her relative youth. She had cooked for the Rowan family for 22 years, ever since she was brought to the plantation as a young woman of 21. She had borne 5 children in those years. 3 of them, Ezekiel, Mercy, and Pearl, had been sold south when they reached the age Thaddeus deemed most profitable. Her 4th child, a boy named Jeremiah, had died of fever at age 4, sparing him the auction block but not his mother's grief. Only her youngest, a daughter named Dove, remained with her, now 16 and working in the great house under Constance Rowan's critical eye. Hestia moved through the kitchen house like a ghost, her hands performing their tasks with mechanical precision while her mind lived elsewhere, in memory of children she would never hold again. She had cooked Magnus Rowan's birthday feasts while her own son celebrated his birthday alone in a Mississippi cotton field. She had prepared Delphine's coming-out party refreshments while her daughter Mercy labored in a Louisiana sugar house. She had baked bread that fed the family who had torn her own family apart, and every loaf was leavened with a hatred so pure it could choke. Monroe Ashford was 32, tall and broad-shouldered from years of field labor, with eyes that held an intelligence he had learned to hide from white observation. He could read, though it was illegal to teach enslaved people their letters in Kentucky. His mother, before she'd been sold away when Monroe was 14, had been owned by a Quaker family who believed in education. She had taught him in secret, and Monroe had continued teaching himself by stealing newspapers from the great house, reading by moonlight in his cabin, slowly building an understanding of the world beyond Bourbon County. Monroe understood what many enslaved people understood but rarely spoke aloud, that slavery was not a natural condition but a system maintained by violence and law, and that both violence and law could be challenged by those willing to pay the price. He had watched the political debates over slavery intensify throughout the 1840s, had read about slave revolts in other states, had heard whispers of the Underground Railroad that could carry people north to freedom. He had also calculated, with the cold logic that would have impressed Thaddeus Rowan had it been applied to tobacco yields, that 60 able-bodied adults working in coordination could overpower a family of 5 and their 2 white overseers. But Monroe had waited, biding his time, knowing that successful resistance required not just strength but timing, planning, and a community united in purpose. He had been waiting for the right moment, the spark that would transform individual suffering into collective action. That spark came in the form of Temperance Vale. Temperance was 19 years old, with her mother's high cheekbones and her father's steady hands, though she'd never known her father, who had been sold away before her birth. She worked in the great house as a chambermaid, changing linens and emptying chamber pots, effectively invisible to the Rowans who barely registered her presence. In March of 1853, she had given birth to a daughter she named Sunday, a perfect infant with curious eyes and a strong cry. Temperance had known that Sunday's time with her would be limited. She had seen the pattern, understood the business model. But she had allowed herself to hope, foolish, dangerous hope, that she might have a few years, that perhaps Sunday would be small enough, young enough, to escape notice when Thaddeus made his next audit. She was wrong. August 1853 brought heat to Kentucky like the opening of a furnace door. The tobacco plants wilted despite watering, the river ran low, and tempers frayed in quarters and great house alike. The enslaved community worked through temperatures that made the air shimmer, bringing in a harvest that would make Thaddeus Rowan even wealthier while they owned not even the sweat that poured from their bodies. On August 15, a Wednesday that dawned hot and would end in devastation, Thaddeus Rowan made his announcement. He gathered the field workers as they returned from the tobacco barns at day's end. Monroe was there, Hestia too, having finished her kitchen duties. The entire enslaved community assembled in the yard between quarters and great house, wondering what pronouncement would come. Thaddeus stood on the great house veranda, Magnus beside him, both holding papers. "I have completed negotiations with Beaumont Cotton Concern of Natchez, Mississippi," Thaddeus announced, his voice carrying in the still evening air. 12 children will be departing for their new situations on Friday morning. The following families will prepare their children for transport. He read the names. 12 children. The oldest was 11, the youngest was Sunday Vale, not yet 6 months old. Temperance's scream tore through the evening air like the cry of a mortally wounded animal. She collapsed to her knees in the dirt, her body convulsing with a grief so profound it seemed impossible that flesh could contain it. Other women joined her, their wails creating a chorus of anguish that echoed off the river valley walls. Thaddeus watched with mild annoyance. "The children will be collected tomorrow afternoon and housed in the separation shed until Friday's departure. I expect all affected parties to maintain work productivity. Emotional displays will not alter business arrangements already concluded." He turned and walked back into the great house, Magnus following, leaving behind a community drowning in fresh grief. That night, something changed in the quarters. The wailing continued for hours, but beneath it, a different sound emerged. Whispers. Urgent, angry whispers that moved from cabin to cabin like contagion. Monroe Ashford stood in the darkness outside Hestia Blackwood's cabin, speaking low to a gathering group. "How many more?" he asked. "How many more children before we say enough?" "They'll kill us," someone whispered back. "You know what happens to slaves who raise their hand against masters." "We're already dying," Hestia's voice came from the darkness, rough from weeping. "I died when they took Ezekiel. Died again with Mercy. Again with Pearl. I'm a walking corpse. What more can they take from me?" Temperance appeared, baby Sunday clutched to her chest. The infant was eerily silent, as though she understood the gravity of the moment. "I won't let them take her," Temperance said, her voice steady despite the tears streaming down her face. "I'll die before I let them put my baby in that shed." "Then we die together," Monroe said quietly. "Or we make them die instead." The whispers continued through the night, plans forming in the darkness. Monroe had been preparing for this moment without knowing it, studying the house layout during his rare trips to deliver firewood, noting where the Rowans kept their weapons, observing the patterns of the overseers. Hestia knew every corner of the great house, every lock and key, having cooked there for more than 2 decades. Others contributed their knowledge. The blacksmith knew where tools could become weapons, the stable hand knew how to quietly disable the horses to prevent anyone from riding for help. The next afternoon, Thursday, Thaddeus's men came for the children. Temperance handed Sunday over with a face like stone, showing nothing of the rage burning inside her. The other mothers did the same, their grief transformed into something harder, colder. They watched their children disappear into the separation shed, and they waited. That night, the heat broke. Storm clouds gathered on the western horizon, rolling across Kentucky like divine judgment made visible. Thunder rumbled in the distance, growing closer. Lightning forked across darkening skies. In the quarters, Hestia Blackwood opened a wooden chest where she kept her most precious possessions, letters she'd written to her souled children though she had no way to send them, a lock of Pearl's baby hair, a piece of cloth from Ezekiel's first shirt. She tucked these items against her chest, then went to meet Monroe and Temperance. In his cabin, Monroe checked the tools he'd gathered, an axe with its blade newly sharpened, rope he'd been collecting for months, a ring of keys he'd made impressions of and had the blacksmith duplicate. In the great house, oblivious to the storm gathering both in the sky and in the quarters below, the Rowan family ate their dinner prepared by Hestia's hands. They discussed the upcoming sale, Thaddeus calculating his profit margin while Constance planned what she would purchase with the proceeds. Magnus suggested they consider expanding their operation, perhaps doubling the frequency of child sales. In the separation shed, 12 children huddled together in the darkness, Sunday's crying the only sound. They were too young to understand that their mothers were planning not rescue, but revenge. Too innocent to know that by dawn, the world they knew would be gone, replaced by something their children's children would whisper about in hushed tones for generations to come. The storm broke at midnight. Rain lashed the plantation, thunder shaking the great house to its foundations. And in the quarters, 40 adults prepared to break their chains with blood and fury. The breaking point had come. What followed would be written in horror and justified rage, a night that would haunt Kentucky's conscience for decades, if conscience could be said to exist in a place built on buying and selling human souls. What you're hearing is historical truth that's been deliberately buried. These people had names, lives, and reasons for what they did. Subscribe to hear how this night of reckoning unfolded, and comment below with your reaction to this suppressed chapter of American history. The story continues. The storm that broke over Bourbon County on the night of September 15, 1853, was the kind that old Kentuckians would speak of for decades after. Lightning split the sky in jagged wounds that seemed to tear the fabric of heaven itself. Thunder rolled across the river valley like artillery fire, shaking the tobacco barns until their timbers groaned. Rain came in sheets so dense that a man couldn't see 5 feet before his face. It was the perfect night for revolution. Monroe Ashford stood in the doorway of his cabin, watching the storm and waiting. Around him in the darkness, 43 adults from the quarters gathered in silence. They had left the elderly behind, and those with infants too young to quiet easily. What was about to happen required able bodies and iron wills. Each person there had made their choice, understanding that there would be no turning back, no mercy if they failed, and likely no mercy even if they succeeded. Hestia Blackwood approached through the rain, her grey hair plastered to her skull, her eyes burning with purpose that 22 years of servitude hadn't extinguished. Behind her came Temperance Vale, her face a mask of terrible calm. In the separation shed, Sunday was crying with the other condemned children. That sound, her baby's wailing mixing with thunder, had burned away whatever remained of Temperance's fear. The overseers? Monroe asked. Collins is drunk in his cottage, reported Isaiah Mercer, the stable hand. Passed out by 9 o'clock. Dalton went to Paris for the night, won't be back until morning. The great house. All lights out except Thaddeus's study, Hestia said. He's working on his ledgers. Constance retired at 10. Magnus is in his room. The baby and Delphine are in the nursery with Sarah keeping watch. Sarah was an enslaved woman who tended the Rowan children, ancient enough that she would not be part of tonight's action but who had, with a single significant look, indicated she would not interfere. Monroe nodded. He had planned this like a military operation, dividing the group into units with specific objectives. A dozen men would secure the overseer cottages and the tool sheds where weapons were kept. Another group would guard the perimeter, preventing anyone from escaping to raise the alarm. The rest would enter the great house. Remember, Monroe said, his voice barely audible over the storm, we are not a mob. We are a court of justice. Every man and woman in that house will stand trial for their crimes before sentence is carried out. He didn't say what everyone already knew, that the sentence had already been decided. Lightning flashed, illuminating the faces around him, faces that had known only subjugation, that had watched their children sold, their bodies beaten, their humanity denied. Tonight, those faces held something that would have terrified Thaddeus Rowan more than any financial loss. They held the power of the righteous, the terrible clarity of people who had nothing left to lose. For our children, Monroe said. For our children, they answered in unison, and moved into the storm. The first part of the operation went smoothly. The men assigned to the overseer cottages found Collins exactly where Isaiah had reported, snoring in an alcohol-induced stupor. They bound him with rope and gagged him with his own shirt. Dalton's empty cottage was searched for weapons. 3 rifles and 2 pistols were found and distributed among those who knew how to use them. At the great house, Hestia used keys she had carefully duplicated over months to unlock the kitchen entrance. Water poured from their clothes as they filed inside, moving through a space most had cleaned countless times but never truly inhabited as anything other than servants. Now they walked through it as conquerors, as judges, as executioners. The house was dark except for lamplight spilling from under Thaddeus's study door. Monroe positioned his people, some at the base of the stairs, others at exits, the rest following him toward that door. He didn't knock. He opened it and walked in as though he owned the place, which in a moral sense, he did. Thaddeus Rowan looked up from his ledgers, his face registering confusion before alarm. What is the meaning of? Stand up, Monroe commanded, and something in his voice, a voice that had never before given commands, only received them, made Thaddeus obey before his mind caught up with his body. 3 men entered behind Monroe, one carrying rope, another the iron shackles that had once bound their own ankles. Within seconds, Thaddeus Rowan, master of 200 acres and nearly 90 human beings, stood chained in his own study, his face draining of color as understanding dawned. You'll hang for this, Thaddeus whispered. Every one of you will hang. Yes, Monroe agreed. We probably will. But not tonight. Tonight, it's your turn. The securing of the house continued with methodical precision. Magnus was pulled from his bed, his protests silenced by a gag. Constance woke to find Hestia Blackwood standing over her, holding a kitchen knife. For the first time in 22 years, Hestia allowed her mistress to see her true face, the face of a mother whose children had been stolen, a woman whose grief had crystallized into something diamond-hard and infinitely sharp. "Please," Constance whimpered. "Please, I have children." "So did I," Hestia said flatly. "Get up." Delphine was brought down from the nursery, weeping, her hands bound in front of her. Old Sarah remained with baby Cornelius, who slept through the chaos, his cherub-carved cradle rocking gently in the storm-shaken house. The Rowan family was assembled in their own parlor, surrounded by people they had thought of as property, as tools no different from the hoes used in their tobacco fields. Now those tools had hands that held weapons, eyes that held judgment, voices that would finally be heard. Monroe stood before them, and when he spoke, his voice carried the weight of 15 years of stolen children, of bodies broken by labor, of spirits crushed beneath the machinery of slavery's economy. "Thaddeus Rowan, Constance Rowan, Magnus Rowan, you are here to answer for your crimes against humanity. You have stolen 43 children from their families. You have sold human beings for profit. You have torn apart families that you claimed didn't truly exist, that you claimed couldn't feel the bonds of love as white families do. Tonight, you will hear testimony from those you have wronged, and then you will face justice." "This is madness," Thaddeus snarled, some of his confidence returning. "You are property. You have no right to judge your betters. The law. The law." Hestia stepped forward, her voice cracking like a whip. "The law that says my children belong to you? The law that says I'm worth $600 but my love for my babies is worth nothing? That law?" She moved closer, the knife still in her hand. "I cooked your food for 22 years. I baked bread with hands that had held my children before you sold them. Do you know what I thought about every time I kneaded that dough, Thaddeus Rowan? I thought about poison. Every single day, I thought about poison." One by one, the testimonies came. Isaiah Mercer spoke of his son, sold at age 8 to a cotton plantation in Alabama, dead within 2 years from heatstroke. Ruth Washington described watching her twin daughters taken away in the same wagon, their screams echoing for miles. Josiah Kent testified about the scarring on his back from Magnus Hickory cane, about beatings administered for the crime of moving too slowly with grief after his child was sold. Temperance Vale spoke last. She had left the separation shed briefly, carrying Sunday in her arms, and now she stood before her owners with her baby held tight. "This is my daughter," she said. "Her name is Sunday Vale. Tomorrow, you plan to sell her to Mississippi. She is 5 months old. You were going to take my baby and put her in a wagon and send her away forever, and you thought this was acceptable. You thought this was good business." She looked at Constance. "You wrote in your diary that enslaved mothers have unhealthy attachments to their children. That we need to have these attachments broken for our own good. I read your diary, ma'am. Hestia brought it to me. Every word." Temperance's voice didn't rise, but it filled the room. "I want you to imagine something. Imagine someone came into your house and took baby Cornelius. Imagine they put him in a shed and then in a wagon and sent him away forever. Imagine you never saw him again, never knew if he was alive or dead, cold or hungry, beaten or sold again. Imagine living with that every day for the rest of your life." She paused. "Now imagine you deserved it. That's what you believed about us." The trial continued for 2 hours. Constance wept, then pleaded, then raged. Magnus cursed and threatened. Thaddeus remained silent, his face gray, perhaps understanding that no words could alter what was coming. When Monroe finally spoke again, his voice was heavy with the weight of history. "The sentence is death. But not clean death. Not quick death. You will die as you lived, surrounded by the symbols of your crimes." They were taken upstairs, to the nursery where baby Cornelius still slept in his cradle. 2 more cradles had been brought in, Delphine's white lacquered cradle from storage, and Magnus' childhood cradle that had been kept as a family heirloom. The work was done before dawn, though dawn seemed reluctant to come, as if the sun itself recoiled from illuminating what the night had wrought. Monroe Ashford stood in the nursery doorway, looking at what they had created. 3 cradles arranged in a triangle. 3 bodies suspended from the canopy frames by ropes, positioned with terrible care to mirror the way infants might lie in sleep. But these were no infants. These were the architects of a system that had valued profit over humanity, and now they hung as monuments to their own cruelty. Behind him, Hestia Blackwood emerged from the shadows. Her hands were clean now, she had washed them in the basin in Constance's own bedroom, using the lavender soap that had been imported from France. "It's time," she said quietly. The storm had passed, leaving behind a preternatural stillness. The enslaved community gathered in the great house one final time, not as servants but as free people, at least for these few remaining hours. They knew what came next. They had always known. "The children," Temperance said, holding Sunday close. "We have to get the children out first." Monroe nodded. The separation shed was opened, and 12 children emerged into the pre-dawn darkness, confused and frightened, but alive. Their mothers claimed them with sobs of relief and joy so profound it seemed to sanctify the horror that had just occurred. Sunday would not be going to Mississippi. None of them would. What followed was organized chaos, a plan that Monroe had been constructing in secret for months, waiting for the moment when it might be needed. He had made contact with conductors on the Underground Railroad who operated in northern Kentucky, Quaker families and free black communities who risked everything to ferry the enslaved to freedom. Tonight, that network would be tested as never before. The enslaved community of Rowans Plantation split into small groups, each taking different routes north. Some would travel by river, hidden in boats that would carry them toward the Ohio. Others would move overland through the Kentucky wilderness, following the North Star toward Cincinnati and the promise of free soil beyond. Monroe had forged papers for some, created stories and identities that might hold up under casual scrutiny. The children went first, with the women and elderly who could make the journey. 87 people became ghosts, disappearing into the Kentucky landscape as completely as morning mist burned away by sun. They took what they could carry and nothing more. Jewelry from the great house, silver candlesticks, anything that could be sold or traded for passage north. These were not thefts, they were reparations, payment for generations of stolen labor. Hestia Blackwood stood in the kitchen house one last time, looking at the space where she had cooked for the Rowan family for 22 years. She had left something on the table, Constance's diary, open to the page where she had written about unhealthy maternal attachments. Beside it, Hestia placed a note in careful handwriting that she had learned in secret, teaching herself letters by candlelight after endless days of labor. For Ezekiel, Mercy, and Pearl, the note read. May their spirits find peace knowing their mother found justice. She walked out without looking back, joining her daughter Dove and the group heading for the river crossing. Monroe Ashford was among the last to leave. He stood in Thaddeus's study, looking at the ledgers that had documented 15 years of family destruction. He considered burning them, destroying the evidence of the Rowan family's systematic evil. But then he reconsidered. Let these ledgers remain. Let them testify to what had driven enslaved people to desperate action. Let history judge who the real criminals were. He left the ledgers open on the desk, Thaddeus's neat columns of profit stained now with rain that had blown through the broken window. The entries seemed obscene in the gray dawn light: male child, age 7, $450. Female child, age 6, $400. Before he left, Monroe performed one final act. He went to the nursery where baby Cornelius still slept, miraculously undisturbed by the night's events, attended by old Sarah who rocked his cradle with gnarled hands. Monroe lifted the baby carefully, wrapping him in a blanket. What are you doing? Sarah whispered. This child is innocent, Monroe said. He didn't choose his parents. He doesn't deserve to die for their sins. He carried Cornelius down the stairs, past the parlor where the trial had occurred, out through the kitchen that Hestia had finally abandoned. In the quarters, he found Miriam Foster, whose own baby had been among the 12 scheduled for sale. She stood with her reclaimed son in her arms, preparing for the journey north. "Take him," Monroe said, offering Cornelius to her. "Raise him as your own, somewhere far from here. Raise him to be better than his blood." Miriam stared at the baby, then at Monroe. The moral complexity of the moment hung between them, to save the child of their oppressor, to show mercy when none had been shown to them. Finally, she nodded and took Cornelius into her arms, where he settled as peacefully as he had in his cherub-carved cradle. "He'll never know who his real family was," Miriam said. "I'll tell him he's mine. Then make sure he grows up knowing that all children deserve to stay with their mothers," Monroe replied. "That's the only memorial his family deserves." By the time Dr. Emmett Caldwell arrived at Rowan Plantation that morning, summoned by a note that Monroe himself had written and left with a river trader to deliver, the enslaved community was long gone. They had dissolved into the Kentucky landscape like sugar in water, leaving behind only the evidence of their final judgment. Caldwell's discovery of the bodies, his ride to Paris to alert the militia, the subsequent investigation, all of this unfolded exactly as Monroe had planned. The doctor's horror would spread through Bourbon County, then across Kentucky, then beyond. The story would be told and retold, growing in its details, becoming legend and warning. The militia arrived from Lexington by noon, a force of 30 men led by Colonel Harrison Blackwell, a man who owned his own plantation in Fayette County. He walked through the great house with growing disbelief, eventually standing in the nursery where he stared at the 3 cradles and their grotesque occupants. "Dear God," he whispered. "How many were there?" "Nearly 90, according to the ledgers," reported his lieutenant. "All vanished. The doctor says the house was empty when he arrived at dawn." Blackwell moved to the window, looking out over the abandoned quarters, the silent tobacco fields, the empty separation shed. "Organize search parties. Send riders to every county within 50 miles. They can't have gotten far with that many people." But they had. The search parties found nothing but cold trails and false leads. A few brave conductors on the Underground Railroad were questioned but revealed nothing under interrogation. The enslaved community of Rowan Plantation had simply evaporated, becoming invisible in ways that free white men couldn't comprehend. In the weeks that followed, a few pieces of information trickled back. A group matching their description had been seen crossing the Ohio River near Maysville. Others had been spotted heading northwest toward Indiana. Some whispered that they'd made it all the way to Detroit, then crossed into Canada where slavery had been abolished decades earlier. The truth was more complex. The community had fractured into small groups, each taking different routes, some successful, some caught and returned to slavery, some lost to disease or accident on the dangerous journey north. But a significant number made it to freedom, perhaps 50 or 60 souls who would live out their lives in places like Toronto, Detroit, Cleveland, and Pittsburgh. Among those who successfully escaped were Hestia Blackwood and her daughter Dove, who settled in a small black community outside of Detroit. Hestia lived another 23 years, working as a cook in a boarding house, free to keep her wages, free to come and go as she pleased. She never spoke publicly about what happened at Rowan Plantation, but those who knew her well reported that she kept a small wooden box containing 3 locks of hair, Ezekiel's, Mercy's, and Pearl's, and that sometimes on quiet evenings, she would hold these relics and whisper to children who could not hear her but who had never been forgotten. Monroe Ashford made it to Canada, where he used his literacy and intelligence to become a teacher in a school for black children. He wrote occasionally for abolitionist newspapers under a pseudonym, always arguing that enslaved people had the right to resist their bondage by any means necessary. He never publicly claimed involvement in the Rowans Plantation Revolt, but some suspected, and those who suspected respected his silence. Temperance Vale and her daughter Sunday disappeared into the network so completely that no record of them exists after 1853. One persistent story claims they settled in a Quaker community in Pennsylvania, where Temperance remarried and raised Sunday and 3 more children in freedom. Another story says they went to Canada. The truth is lost to history, but what matters is that Sunday Vale grew up free, never knowing the terror of the separation shed, never experiencing the grief of a mother whose child is stolen for profit. Baby Cornelius Rowan, raised by Miriam Foster as her own son in a free black community in Ohio, grew up believing he was born to an enslaved woman who had escaped to freedom. He learned a trade as a blacksmith, married, had children of his own. He died in 1912 at age 59, never knowing that his birth family had been killed in a slave revolt, never knowing that he owed his life to the mercy of people who had every reason to let him die with his parents. The Rowan plantation itself stood abandoned for months. No one wanted to buy property associated with such horror, and the Rowan extended family, distant cousins in Louisville, wanted nothing to do with the tainted estate. Eventually, the property was seized for back taxes and sold at auction for a fraction of its value. The great house acquired a reputation for being haunted. People reported lights in the windows at night, the sound of children crying, cradle songs carried on the wind. Some claimed to see figures moving through the rooms, enslaved people who had died there over the decades, walking through walls, attending to tasks they would never finish. The nursery was considered especially cursed. The 3 cradles had been removed by the militia, burned along with the ropes that had suspended their grim burden, but people swore they could still see them in the empty room, still hear the creak of wood and the whisper of rope. Local people began calling it Cradle House, and the name stuck. The story of Rowan Plantation was deliberately erased from historical record, but it deserves to be remembered. Subscribe to hear the final chapter about the haunting legacy this night left behind. Comment below with what you think the cradles symbolized. What message were these people sending to history? The official record of what happened at Rowan Plantation in September 1853 is remarkably brief, almost deliberately so. The Kentucky State Archives contain a single document, a coroner's report filed by Dr. Emmett Caldwell describing the deaths of Thaddeus Rowan, age 47, Constance Rowan, age 42, and Magnus Rowan, age 18, as murder by person or persons unknown, believed to be fugitive slaves. That's it. 3 lines in a ledger, buried among thousands of other deaths recorded in Bourbon County during the 1850s. No newspaper accounts from the period survive, though historians have found references in personal letters suggesting that local papers were pressured not to report the incident in detail. No trial records exist, because no one was ever caught or charged. No monuments mark the spot where the Rowan family died, no historical plaques acknowledge what happened there. The silence is not accidental. It is the sound of history being deliberately erased. Because the Rowan Plantation Revolt represented something that the slaveholding South could not afford to acknowledge, that enslaved people were capable of organized, purposeful, sophisticated resistance. That they could plan, coordinate, and execute a revolution. That they could hold trials and pass judgments and carry out sentences. That they were, in every meaningful sense, fully human, capable of the same range of emotions and actions as their oppressors, including rage, justice, and revenge. The myth that sustained slavery required the enslaved to be seen as passive, as accepting their condition, as incapable of the kind of complex thought and moral reasoning that would justify rebellion. Every slave revolt threatened that myth, but the Rowan uprising threatened it in a particularly dangerous way because of its symbolic sophistication. The cradles. Those damned cradles that Dr. Caldwell could never forget, that Colonel Blackwell ordered burned immediately, that everyone who saw them understood on a visceral level. The message was unmistakable: you took our children from their cradles. You sold them away, destroyed our families, told us that our bonds of love were not real, that our grief was not genuine, that we couldn't feel the way white families feel. So now your family dies in the cradles where your children slept, and let the world see what you valued more than human life. It was punishment that was also performance, revenge that was also testimony. And that's what made it unacceptable to record in history. Because to describe it accurately would be to admit that enslaved people had legitimate grievances, that their actions had moral logic, that the horror they inflicted was a mirror held up to the horror of slavery itself. So the story was buried. But buried stories have a way of seeping back into the light, like groundwater finding cracks in concrete. In the decades after the Civil War, when formerly enslaved people began telling their stories publicly, fragments of the Rowan Plantation Revolt surfaced. An elderly woman in Detroit named Hestia, no last name recorded, told an interviewer in 1876 that she had once worked on a plantation in Kentucky where justice came at midnight during a storm. She refused to elaborate, but the interviewer noted that she kept a small wooden box containing locks of hair from children she said had been stolen from her. A school teacher in Toronto named Monroe, again, no full name, wrote an essay in 1868 for an abolitionist publication titled The Right of the Oppressed to Judge Their Oppressors. In it, he argued that enslaved people who killed their masters were not murderers but executioners, carrying out sentences that legal systems refused to impose. He never mentioned Rowan Plantation specifically, but those who knew the story recognized his meaning. These fragments, these hints and whispers, were all that survived in the official record. But in black communities across the North, the story lived on in fuller form, passed down through oral tradition. Grandparents told grandchildren about the night the Cradles held corpses instead of babies, about the enslaved community that vanished into freedom, about the symbolic justice that shocked Kentucky to its core. The story grew in the telling, as stories do. Some versions claimed supernatural elements, that the spirits of sold children returned to guide their parents' hands, that lightning struck the great house at the exact moment of the executions, that the Rowan family's ghosts still wander the abandoned plantation searching for the children they sold. These embellishments don't diminish the truth of what happened, they represent communities trying to make sense of trauma, to find meaning in resistance, to transform historical horror into moral fable. And Cradle House itself? The physical structure stood for another 70 years, slowly decaying. The roof collapsed in the 1890s. The columns cracked and fell in the 1920s. By the Great Depression, it was nothing but a foundation and scattered timbers, slowly being reclaimed by Kentucky wilderness. But the land never recovered its value. Every attempt to farm the property failed. Tobacco planted in those fields withered and died. Attempts to graze cattle ended when animals refused to enter certain areas, particularly the spot where the great house had stood. Local people whispered that the land was cursed, that the blood spilled there, both the blood of the Rowan family and the metaphorical blood of decades of enslaved suffering, had poisoned the soil permanently. In 1934, during a drought that devastated Kentucky agriculture, a team of surveyors mapping Bourbon County reported something strange about the old Rowan property. Their instruments malfunctioned near the former great house site. Compasses spun uselessly. Theodolites showed impossible readings. The surveyors, practical men not given to superstition, nevertheless refused to camp on the property, choosing instead to work from adjacent land and estimate the readings for the cursed acres. Their report, filed with the county assessor's office, contained a handwritten note at the bottom: something wrong with this land. Recommend against development. Let it lie fallow. The land has remained fallow ever since. In the 1960s, during the civil rights movement, there was a brief effort by local historians to research the Rowan Plantation story more thoroughly, to perhaps establish a memorial or historical marker acknowledging what had happened there. The effort was quietly discouraged by Bourbon County officials who felt that such a memorial would be divisive and inflammatory. The academics involved in the research discovered something interesting, though. When they examined census records, property deeds, and tax documents from 1853 and subsequent years, they found that references to Rowan Plantation had been systematically altered or removed. Pages were missing from ledgers. Whole sections of property records had been destroyed by water damage or fire. It was as if someone, or multiple someones, had worked deliberately to erase the plantation from official memory. This erasure extended to the enslaved people themselves. The researcher found no record of the names of anyone who had been enslaved at Rowan Plantation. No bill of sale, no property inventory, no census notation. Thaddeus Rowan's famous ledgers, which had documented 15 years of child sales with such meticulous detail, had vanished completely. They were not in the county archives, not in private collections, not in any university library in Kentucky. Gone. As if 87 people had never existed at all. This is how historical erasure works. Not through dramatic book burnings or single acts of censorship, but through 1,000 small decisions to look away, to file something incorrectly, to allow a document to be lost, to decide that some stories are better left untold. But the story persisted despite these efforts. In the 21st century, genealogists working on family histories for descendants of enslaved people have uncovered new fragments. DNA testing has confirmed that several families in Canada and the northern United States have ancestors who likely came from Bourbon County, Kentucky, around 1853. Oral histories passed down through these families contain remarkably consistent details about a plantation revolt, a night of judgment, and a mass escape. These descendants have formed an informal network, sharing research and stories, trying to piece together the full narrative of what happened and who their ancestors were. They've identified possible names: Hestia Blackwood, Monroe Ashford, Temperance Vale, though they can't confirm these with certainty. They've located the site of the old Rowan Plantation, now overgrown forest along the Kentucky River, marked only by depressions in the earth where buildings once stood. In 2019, a small group of these descendants visited the site. They brought flowers and sang hymns and poured libations for ancestors whose names they didn't know but whose courage they honored. They stood where the great house had been and tried to imagine what that September night had been like: the storm, the rage, the terrible clarity of people who had finally said, enough. One descendant, a woman whose great-great-great-grandmother had possibly been among those who escaped, said something that captured the essential truth of the Rowans Plantation Revolt: my ancestor wasn't a victim. She was a revolutionary. And that's what history can't forgive. Because that's the uncomfortable truth at the heart of this story and stories like it. American history prefers to remember enslaved people as victims rescued by white abolitionists or freed by white politicians. The narrative of passive suffering ended by white saviors is easier to digest than the narrative of black people taking their own freedom through force, of enslaved people sitting in judgment of their masters and finding them guilty, of the oppressed becoming executioners. The Rowans Plantation Revolt was not an isolated incident. Historians have documented dozens of similar uprisings across the South during the slavery era, from small-scale poisonings to large revolts like Nat Turner's Rebellion. But most of these stories have been suppressed or sanitized, their participants portrayed as mindless brutes rather than as people driven to desperate action by systematic cruelty. The Cradles at Rowans Plantation were not mindless brutality. They were a message written in a language that slaveholders understood, the language of destroyed families, of childhood innocence commodified and sold. The enslaved community was saying, in the clearest possible terms, you valued your profits more than our children, so now your children's cradles will hold your corpses. This is the world you created. This is justice in the kingdom of cruelty. And perhaps that's the most terrifying thing about the Rowans Plantation story, not the violence itself, but the fact that it made perfect moral sense. That the horror inflicted on the Rowan family was proportional to the horror they had inflicted on dozens of families over 15 years. That the cradles were not excessive symbolism but precise accounting, a balancing of the books that Thaddeus Rowan would have understood on a fundamental level. Today, if you visit Bourbon County, Kentucky, you can still find the spot where Rowans Plantation once stood, though you'll need to search for it. There are no historical markers, no tourist attractions, no acknowledgement that anything significant ever happened there. The Kentucky River still flows past, as it did in 1853. The land is still thick with trees, reclaiming what was once cultivated fields. And on quiet evenings, if you listen carefully, local people will tell you that you can still hear things in those woods. Cradle songs. Children's laughter. The creak of rocking wood. Whispers in the darkness. Some say it's the ghosts of the Rowan children, cursed to haunt the place where their parents' sins brought destruction. Others say it's the spirits of the enslaved children who were sold away, finally free to play and sing without fear. Still others claim it's the sound of justice itself, a reminder that some debts can never be fully paid, some crimes can never be fully punished, and some stories refuse to stay buried no matter how deeply they're hidden. The truth is probably simpler and more profound. What you hear in those woods is the sound of history speaking, of suppressed narratives demanding to be heard, of people who were treated as property asserting their humanity in the only way left to them. Hestia Blackwood. Monroe Ashford. Temperance Vale. Isaiah Mercer. Ruth Washington, Josiah Kent, Miriam Foster, and dozens of others whose names we may never know. They were not property. They were not passive victims. They were human beings who loved their children, who felt grief and rage, who planned and organized and acted with terrible purpose. They were revolutionaries who wrote their Declaration of Independence in blood and symbolism, who chose the hazards of freedom over the certainty of continued bondage. History tried to erase them. The official record tried to reduce them to a single line, murder by person or persons unknown. But the story survived, passed down through generations, whispered in black communities, preserved in oral tradition, and finally, slowly, being recovered and told in fuller form. The Cradles are gone, burned by a militia colonel who understood too well what they represented. The great house is gone, collapsed into earth and memory. The people who planned and carried out the revolt are gone, their bones resting in graves scattered across North America, most unmarked, most forgotten. But the story remains. And it matters. Not because we should glorify violence, but because we should honor the full humanity of those who resisted dehumanization. Because we should acknowledge that enslaved people were agents in their own history, not just objects acted upon. Because we should recognize that the horror of slavery created horrors in response, and that those responses, however terrible, came from the same place as any parent's love for their children. The Rowans Plantation Revolt is a story of macabre horror, yes. But it's also a story of love so fierce it turned to rage, of grief so deep it demanded justice, of humanity so resilient that neither chains nor laws nor centuries of oppression could fully extinguish it. And on quiet Kentucky evenings, when the wind moves through the trees where Rowans Plantation once stood, you can still hear the cradle songs. Still hear the whispers. Still hear the voices of those whom history tried to silence. They're still speaking. We just have to listen. This is the dark history they don't teach in schools. Subscribe for more macabre historical horror stories that honor the resistance of those who fought back against oppression. Like this video if you believe these suppressed narratives deserve to be told. Comment with your thoughts on this forgotten chapter of American history, and stay tuned for the next dark tale from our past.